After the 2.5 hours for which everything that follows from now on has to be heard to put it into context, they turn up and they're going to leave for a deadline for tomorrow's paper, and they're going to do a report on this event. I mean, bloody hell. No wonder people are turning to alternative news outlets. Okay, let's go. And to be fair to the person involved, who's just doing her job, what chance has she got, even if she wanted to, of putting this event in context, having missed the first 3.5 hours and missing probably most of what's to come after this section? Anyway, let's have a recap. This is who we are. We are infinite awareness having an experience. The idea of the conspiracy is to make us identify with the experience. Boom! Little me, I have no power. I am all limited. I am just someone who has to follow others. And to manipulate the way we decode reality to fit the ability of the few to control the many by keeping the many in a fraction of who they really are, by identifying with name, with job, with family and income bracket instead of the true nature of infinite self, and to hijack the way we decode reality through the five senses to impose a very different one, to give us the idea that we must follow, we have no power. Someone else must tell us what to think, what to do. And it's control of perception. Like I said earlier, if you control someone's perception, you control their actions, which come from perceptions. And that's the idea. And all these things, interestingly, all those news organizations, what are they doing? They're telling people what to think. And the other thing is that when you, especially as we go through the section after this one, all the different expressions of this conspiracy, everything from banking scams to vaccines to fake human-caused global warming, stuff in additives in food, fake terrorist attacks so that you can change society by justifying change. The idea that all this is being orchestrated by men and women in dark suits or whatever, sitting around a table, it takes on the bounds of ludicrousness. Do these exist? Of course they do. But they are the outer rim of the rabbit hole. And when you go beyond them, deeper into the manipulation, you go through them into the advisors. The people that we think are in power, they're only for public consumption. They're here today, gone tomorrow people in all the areas of institutions and politics, and another bunch will come along tomorrow, but the same force will be controlling them as well. That's the common theme, that's the cement. And you hit the advisors one step back. You go deeper in the rabbit hole, and you go into these really exclusive secret societies, which are way back out of the public domain, and yet they are fundamentally influencing and impacting on what happens in the public domain. So when you've got someone like Obama, he is announcing legislation, he's signing executive orders and death lists for bloody drone missiles in Pakistan, etc. But he ain't the one who's deciding all this. He's the one that's the point that brings it into reality through legislative change. And so behind all these apparently unconnected areas like banks and biotech cartels and NATO and the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, the media and all this stuff at ownership level is this same force in the background. And indeed, you know, to a certain extent, this was acknowledged by the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich when they did this study on the connections between transnational corporations. And they found that these ones that are really red, these very, very few, have so many connections to the others, in effect, that's one unit, which is what I've been saying for bloody years, that behind the apparent independence of these corporations, they're actually controlled and connected into the same group. And, you know, you've got these green lines connecting these transnational corporations, but around this group, there's so many connections, it's just one blob of green. And when you take the next step and you realize that the same network of families are actually controlling all these apparently unconnected transnational corporations, suddenly you can see that it's possible to push the world through all these different aspects of society in a common direction. So we have this thing, we call it globalization. What is globalization? It is the centralization of power in every area of our lives. When there's a few and you want to control the many, you have to centralize decision making. The more diversity of decision making there is, the more power obviously is diverted away from the center. The more you centralize, the fewer have control of more and more and more. So this is why we've seen this process of so-called globalization, which is what? It is centralizing power into fewer and fewer hands, so fewer and fewer people are having a bigger say and impact on more and more people. This is the idea. It's the only way you can do it. And like I think I said earlier, the more you centralize power, the more power you have at the center to centralize even quicker. That's why this process of centralization has got faster and faster. And as you can see, as we saw in the Olympics, the power of the corporations, the British public put in like 9 billion into the Olympics, and the corporations together put in about 1 billion, and yet they got everything. So much so that little people in their businesses or homes were being threatened with with the law if they just put some of the major symbols of the Olympics or words, in a display. I was on the Isle of Wight. I just went out of interest, took a few pictures when the flame came through. I want to see what happened. This little town on the Isle of Wight, East Cowes, that you would never know the Olympic flame was coming through. There was nothing. Why? Because they were all terrified of being sued by the corporations and those in government representing the corporations that had hijacked the Olympics. So it doesn't matter who is the president or prime minister, because the same force is in control. What force is that? And if you look at these underground bases, they call them DUMBs, deep underground military bases, they're all over the world. The level of security clearance to go deep into these bases and know what's going on is way above anybody political leader. They haven't got a clue what's going on in here. So they get elected and they have he's a prime minister, he's got power, oh, someone else has come in. And while all that's going on, someone's running these bloody things without the people in political power, apparent power, having a clue about it. If we find who is running these things, then we're getting very close to who's actually running the direction of human society. So behind it all is a force. The question is, what is it? So this is where we enter the twilight zone. But it's a twilight zone, again, everything is a point of observation. A twilight zone to a mainstream journalist will be perfectly bloody logical to someone who's done 50 years or so, or 25 years, or how many years it is of research into something. This is an important point about perception. One of the greatest ways that humanity is controlled is by the suppression of the sense of the possible. Once you put a wall on the sense of the possible, gotcha! Because anything that comes in, say the lie, if the sense of the possible is not fluid but rigid, it will have no alternative to the lie. I'll give you an example. If the mind is so rigid about possibility that it cannot perceive the fact that you can mind manipulate someone to either go shooting people in a crazed shooting, or be in the wrong place at the wrong time to be blamed for it when someone else has actually done it, then when the government comes out, whatever it is, and gives you the version of Dunblane, or gives you a version of the Colorado shooting in the theater and the shooting in the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, then you have no alternative to the lie, because you can't perceive the possibility of anything else. But if you've got an open mind and an inquiring mind and a much wider sense of the possible, then you can look at the lie from another perspective and say, well, maybe this is what happened. So controlling the sense of the possible, because if you're doing things out here and you've got the sense of the possible here, then when people like me say, this is what's going on, that goes, you're bloody mad. That's not possible. That can't be going on. And the biggest problem is that, and it's not every one of them, by the way. I was talking to one the other day who was very kind of intelligent, involved in all this. But this, in general, is my experience after 25 years of the perception of the possible of a mainstream bloody journalist. And that's why people who speak the greater truth, and have done throughout the period of the media, have invariably been ridiculed and dismissed, because that cannot perceive that the possibility that it can be true. And control of history is also a massive part of this. George Orwell talked in 1984 about basically who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past, in the sense of, if you can give a fake version of how we got here, you are going to give people a big distorted fix on where they are. So history is a real target to distort, to give a distorted version of what's happening now. So let's go through history, and let's go in the twilight zone, but from my perspective, perfectly logical from my research. Some time ago, probably a very long time ago, this reality, the part that we're experiencing, what we call the world, the earth, was hijacked. And it was hijacked through entities that operate outside of human sight. Now, as we talked in the first 2.5 hours, visible light, which is the only frequency range that humans can perceive in the conscious mind, is tiny. Anything that operates outside of that we can't see. But it can, if it's close enough in frequency terms, interact with this reality. And the world that is described in ancient accounts all over the world, it's a real common theme, that preceded this hijack, was in many ways similar to that portrayed in the Avatar movie. It was a world where human consciousness was much more expanded. It understood the connections between everything. It understood that at the energetic, electromagnetic level, that you could communicate with plants, you could communicate with animals, you could communicate with apparently inanimate objects, which are only inanimate on the holographic level to our perception. And there was this sense of oneness, this sense of connectiveness, this sense of understanding that we are just a point of attention within a greater whole. And it was a heart society, going on from what I said earlier. They rather interacted with reality from the heart center rather than the gut, which is where most people in our society today do. In other words, we were coming from this heart vortex area. Now, as I talked about, this is an access point through the illusion into the greater whole. And so when you're coming from a heart connection and a heart perception of society, it is dramatically different and creates a dramatically different society to the one we have now. But then came what I call the schism, a massive distortion in the information waveform construct of this reality. And as this distortion happened, there was a distortion in, as I talked about earlier again, the electromagnetic forces that hold the planets and planetary bodies in some kind of stable orbit, and a lot of these planets went walkabout. The solar system we see today is not how it was in the relatively recent past. This is a book called The Saturn Myth by a researcher called David Talbot. It's probably the best book on ancient symbolism that I've ever come across. It's absolutely first-class research. Came out some years ago now. And from his massive, detailed research over many, many years of ancient accounts and descriptions and symbols, he found all these common themes relating to the fact that what we today call Saturn was not where it is now and was not what it is now in terms of the rings and what have you, but was much, much closer to the Earth, to the point that it was in terms of, because it's not a planet, Saturn, it's a dwarf star, so is Jupiter. And it was the prime source of light as the solar system was before this great distortion, this great cataclysm. And looking from the Earth, you saw Venus, and in the middle of that you saw Mars. And here's another, mock-up of the view of this from the Earth. Therefore, Saturn, as it would, became absolutely the center of focus of Earth's society before all this happened. Now, people like Immanuel Velikovsky in the 50s and 60s, he was massively ridiculed for coming out with a series of books pointing out that, in his view and his research, there was massive cataclysmic events in the solar system, and the planets and planetary bodies aren't now where they once were not that long ago. Of course, he was ridiculed. Of course, he was dismissed. But he was a fantastic pioneer for not detailed truth in everything that he said. How can you do that when you're trying to uncover something that doesn't want to be uncovered? But it was a fantastic trailblazing theme that he had, which has been taken up by people like David Talbot and Wallace Thornhill. Wallace Thornhill is involved very, very strongly with the electric universe research that I talked about earlier. And he adds his physics and electronics background to David Talbot's ancient symbolism and accounts background. Saturn, which I say didn't look like that in those days, and Jupiter was certainly involved in these cataclysms. And the effect on the Earth is one of the great universal themes in every ancient culture. Of course, we have the classic coming through the Bible of the great flood and Noah and what have you, but that is just a rewrite of more ancient texts in Mesopotamia, and it's the same theme all over the world, a fantastic geological and cataclysmic events that basically brought the society that was there then to an end. That's Avatar society that I was talking about. And when you look at it, you look at some of the great earth upheavals that we've had. Things like the tsunami in Japan and great earthquakes. Now, they're devastating. I mean, the tsunami was unbelievable in Japan, and also the one earlier that was massively destructive. But at least there was the ability of people unaffected to come and help. When you have a global cataclysm like the one all these ancient accounts describe, then there ain't no one coming, because everyone's in the same situation. And if that happened today, very soon, first of all, what we call civilization will be over. Electricity, gone. Everything to do with electricity, gone. Oil, anything to do with it, gone. It would immediately become a primitive society from the perspective of today. And soon, the knowledge of the more advanced society that was destroyed would be lost, and it would only be passed over in myths and stuff like that. And of course, it has been. Endless stories about great continents, which people call Atlantis and Mu or Lemuria, in the Pacific and the Atlantic, crashing under the waves in this great cataclysm. And under the sea around the world are certainly some extraordinary buildings and cities that were once above the surface of the water. Now, as I mentioned in the first half, the base construct of this universe is waveform information. So any distortion at that level, and this is where the whole thing was created from, this massive cataclysmic event, will play through to the holographic as great distortions that we will see as great geological and weather events. And it was at this point that the solar system became eventually what it is now. And a lot of researchers into this area of the cataclysm look at the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter and say, well, their view, they may well be right, that that's the remnant of some planet or planets that operated in that area before the great cataclysm. So when it happened, the crazies moved in. This force that I'm talking about, that I say, and many, many, many of the ancient texts say, were behind the creation of this cataclysm. Not only that, because the mind also works in this waveform level, any distortion at that level will distort human perception, will distort the human mind. And we went from, when I say we, I mean humanity, went from a connected society, an open, aware, expanded consciousness society, into the one that eventually became the controlled society, and even more controlled society that we see today. And these entities were behind it. And the heart interaction also was a victim of this great cataclysmic happening. Because what happened, not least because of the distortion, but also because of the impact of these entities, we moved from being a heart-centered, heart perception society into the gut. I mean, today, when I say the gut, I mean the emotion. We interact with society today and events today through emotion overwhelmingly. More and more, what does your heart say has become, what does your gut tell you? And we're reacting. We're not thinking, we're not feeling, we're reacting emotionally. And that has massive benefits for the manipulating forces I'll come to. And so the more that we dropped into this gut-based, emotion-reacting society, the more we got pulled out of that heart coherence I talked about earlier, which brings the heart electromagnetic field into coherence with the brain and with the other systems to create this connection that takes you, as the Heart Math Institute in America found, into this higher level of consciousness. In other words, boom, it went the other way. And like I say, the Institute of Heart Math talks about when you go from the heart vortex, the heart electromagnetic field, you go out of the bounds of time and space, the illusion, into the greater understanding of self. So this hijack more and more closed that connection down, and we became a five-sense society overwhelmingly, and therefore locked in to this tiny band of frequency we call visible light, and at the expense of the wider perception that this is just part of who we are, not the totality of it. And more, the body-mind level got disconnected from the greater consciousness level, and once that happens, then we're in real trouble. We then start to see this as the only reality, instead of realizing that this is the totality and the infinity of what we are beyond this tiny band of frequencies we call the world. Now, these entities I'm talking about are talked about and mentioned in every ancient society under different names. And these are interesting to me. This is what they're called by some Central American shaman, the flyers, just a name. We have the demons in Christianity. We have the archons, that is the name for these entities of the Gnostic belief and the Gnostic writings from like 2,000 years ago, around that period and later. And the Islamic jinn. Because the way all of these entities or phenomenon are described is precisely the same, in effect. They're different names for the same thing. And the archons, as the Gnostics called them, were said to be made from luminous fire. The jinn from Islamic and pre-Islamic Arabia were said to be made of smokeless fire. And when you look at what's said about, they're talking about the same force, the same phenomenon. So what is it? The Gnostics are very interesting. Gnostic coming from a word meaning knowledge. Whenever Gnostic thinkers showed any sign of getting their point across and circulating their knowledge and their beliefs, they were slaughtered. I mean, that is just a constant. The Cathars that were slaughtered in southern France, ending up on the castle of Montségur in 1244, they were Gnostic thinkers. The people that ran the great library of Alexandria with its 500,000 scrolls of ancient knowledge which the Roman Church destroyed, they were Gnostic thinkers. And as a result of this, very little Gnostic writing has made it through what we call history. But then in 1945, a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a sealed jar of Gnostic writings was found hidden. And from that has come a fantastically greater understanding of what the Gnostics were talking about. These were mystics. They went out into other levels of reality. In many ways, we call them shaman today, many of them. This is what they talk about in these writings. They talk about the Lord Archon, or what they call the Demiurge, and the Archons that serve the Demiurge and the Lord Archon, as they call him. And they relate this to the Judeo-Christian Yahweh Jehovah God. They also relate it, in effect, to what people call Satan or the devil as well. They say that these Archons created the physical universe that we see, but not the earth, the sun, or the moon. And it's interesting that those three bodies have tremendous connections geometrically and mathematically, which none of the other planets do. Anyway, Archon means prince, ruler, authorities, and it has the connotation also of being from the beginning, because the Gnostics said that actually from the beginning of this solar system that we see and experience, they have been here because they were actually the creators of it, apart from those bodies I'm talking about. They talk about the Demiurge being a fake god that created the physical material reality that we perceive. And they talk about these entities being inorganic, like cyborgs, like robotic. And these writings are about 1,600 years old, a bit more maybe, and yet they knew that in terms of the relationship between the Earth and the rest of the solar system, the Earth was alive and organic, and the rest of the solar system was basically not alive and inorganic. How did they know that? Because they were able to get out there and were very, very knowledgeable. And that's why they were attacked by that which didn't want that knowledge circulating. This, in effect, is very much the feeling of what they describe as an Archon world, because the Archons have no creativity as humans do, and therefore their world is stark and ugly and uniform. This is another wonderful symbolic picture of an Archon world, an Archon reality. And that's because these writings say they have I think the direct translation is no intentionality. I put it another way, no creative imagination. And the writings from best part of 2,000 years ago make it clear that they envy humans who have this creative imagination, the ability to create. Like I say, they describe the Archons as cyborgs, a robotic race that can imitate but not innovate. They call it, in a translated word, counter-mimicry. Put simply, if you gave them a blank sheet of paper, they would know what to do with it. But you give them a sheet of paper with something on it, with something created on it, and they are able to distort it and twist it. But they can mimic and imitate, they cannot create in that sense. Interestingly, they also use the word fantasia. And in that sense, what they're saying is that these Archons, jinn, different names, but I'll use the word Archon as a consistent, have the ability to create fake realities, to distort reality, counter-mimicry, to give people the view or the feeling of a perception that seems real but isn't. Mind parasites, they possess the mind and influence the mind in a negative way, particularly in a negatively emotional way. The one word they say that can absolutely describe the Archons is deception. And also they say that one of their great means of operation, modus operandi, is to invert everything. That's what they're doing, counter-mimicry. They are inverting what is already created so it becomes something else. And it's no accident that one of the great forces that worship these archons within human society, what we call Satanism, use inversion as part of its symbolism. The inverted cross, the inverted five-pointed star. And so I've used this quote before in talks, and from this archontic perception, it becomes even more relevant. Michael Elner, who said, "Just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, universities destroy knowledge, governments destroy freedom, the major media destroy information, and religions destroy spirituality." Everything inverted. This is classic. Politicians, knowingly, some of them, most of them unknowingly, that are promoters and pushers of the archontic agenda, they are famous for bloody lying, inversion of truth. This is a quote from the English writer Noel Coward, who said, quite rightly, "It is discouraging to think how many people are shocked by honesty and how few by deceit. Such is the level of deceit in our society." One word to describe the archontic influence: deception. So this force I talked about earlier that operates behind the crazes in politics and banking and business and media ownership and all the other stuff is this archontic force, which takes many expressions, as I'll come to. And this is absolutely, massively significant. The Gnostics talk about something called hell in relation to these archontic manipulators, and hell means, in our translation, simulation of a virtual reality. A reality that appears real to the decoder, but is not actually real. It's a fake reality. And given what I've been talking about for a few years now, the Gnostic texts describe reptilian entities in relation to being an expression of this archontic force, and 1,600 bloody years ago, they described grey entities, and they describe them as being expressions of the archons, and they say these grey entities are like an unformed baby or a fetus with grey skin and dark, unmoving eyes. They were around thousands of years ago. We think they're a modern phenomenon. No, this manipulation has been going on for a fantastic amount of what we call time. So, what can we ridicule? What's the latest thing to ridicule Icke for? Well, right, let's get a list. They must be adding to it by now. He's been talking for a while at that Wembley place. But one of the things they ridicule me for is the idea that reptilian entities are behind this manipulation of human society. And people can deny their existence if they like. I do not give a shit. They exist. This is a Spanish artist called Robert Ilimos. I spoke in Barcelona, was it 2011, something like that? And he was introduced to me because he'd had an experience which he, thought I might be able to explain. He was into none of this stuff, never heard of me, never heard of bloody reptilians or anything. But he had a partner who which is Brazilian. So he was in Brazil in 2009, I think it was. Yes, 2009. And he's out on his own painting the landscape in his own unique kind of way. He's got his easel and stuff, and he's on his own and he's painting away in this landscape. And he said, then this came down in front of him. Bit of a surprise, I suppose. And he said it was completely closed up apart from this window, and there were two entities in the window. And he said this thing came down and just stayed there for ages. He said, I don't know if I was taken aboard. He said, I have no recollection of it. And of course, he's got his bloody easel in front of him. He starts painting it, this chap. And what he saw at the window were these reptilian-type entities just staring at him, looking at him. And these entities exist. I mean, the what he has painted is also described, and indeed painted, by other people all over the world who've had the same basic experience of these entities. And I had to bloody smile that this year, the Daily Mail has been taking the piss out of me over this for ages, like all the other buggers. And they run a perfectly straight story, headlined, "Welcome to our new lizard overlord. Studies suggest alien worlds could be full of super intelligent dinosaurs." but because it's a scientist saying it, it must be bloody true. That Icke, he left school at 15, he can't be right, oh bloody hell. Now, what is also interesting about these Gnostic writings is that they clearly were in many ways a blueprint for what became a lot of the biblical writings, but they were distorted. A lot of things were removed that were in the Gnostic writings. And one of the things in these texts says, the Lord Archon, demiurge as they call it, come, let us create a man according to our image of God and according to our likeness, that his image may become a light for us. And of course that became a similarly biblical story, but distorted. Even the History Channel has had a series, Ancient Aliens, the series, and one of those programs in that series was about all the ancient descriptions of interbreeding between humans and non-humans to create hybrid bloodlines. And when we talk about interbreeding, because of what we talked about earlier, the nature of reality, it doesn't mean some entity has to have sex with some human, nor does it even mean, it may do, but it doesn't even mean that there has to be some kind of genetic manipulation. There probably was, there doesn't have to be, because if you can change the information blueprint at this level, then it comes through to the holographic level as a completely genetically different entity. It's just an information change. So all these things are possible. But certainly they're all over the ancient world, this is the most famous one, but all over the ancient world, there are descriptions of interbreeding between non-human entities and humans, creating hybrid bloodlines. This is Genesis. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And this is called the genetic disk. It was found in Colombia. It is estimated to be at least 6,000 years old. And on it are depicted human sperm, human female eggs, the birth process, the whole shebang, fetuses. They knew that far back about all this stuff, because in ancient society there were high levels of awareness, not least because of these entities, but also in the pre-cataclysmic societies, and that got lost when the cataclysms brought an end to that and people went back to basically a primitive society would actually build up again. And of course, when you talk about the so-called fall of man, which is all connected to this, the fall into a lower state of consciousness, I would suggest, then reptilian snakes seem to be involved in that. And what is also described is the genetic manipulation of the human form. Again, some people have kind of decoded this or expressed this as these entities created humans. Bollocks. No, what they did was change what already existed. It's absolutely in line with what the Gnostics talk about in terms of this archontic force. They changed what already existed, and they manipulated human genetics so we interacted with reality in a completely different way and became much more suppressed in terms of our ability to perceive reality. We no longer were the connected people of before, and we got put in these bubbles of sense of reality, which has held us in servitude ever since. If you have harmony in the waveform level, then that will play through as harmony in the holographic world of the conscious mind. If you have a massive distortion in that level, it will play through as massive distortions in the holographic world of the conscious mind. A world now of war, people dying of hunger in a world of plenty, about me, conflict on all bloody levels. All this came through from this distortion. They're all expressions of this distortion, and it allowed these entities from just outside of human perception, in frequency terms, to manipulate these this reality that we experience as the world. And they are the force, this is absolutely crucial as we go along, these entities, and that which is an expression of these entities, are all worshipped in the end by all the major religions, people might like that who follow one, but all the major religions, I'll come into that as we go along. The secret societies, which are compartmentalized, they, at the highest inner core level, know that what these secret societies are worshipping are these entities, and Satanism, in its own enclosed secrecy, openly worships these entities and sacrifices people to these entities. This is what sacrifice to the gods is all about in the ancient world. This. And behind the institutions of banking and politics, media, religion, and all of it, are these entities through particular bloodlines that I will talk about in a second, which in the end all come back to the same force. Now, you've got to see a lot of these, because if something is a force operating through all these different areas of society, ancient and modern, then the same themes are going to come through all those different things. And they do, as I'll show very clearly as we go through in this section. Common themes, here's one: worship of the reptile. It's in our face if you look at it. The oldest known, this is mainstream anthropology and stuff, the oldest known focus of religious worship is the serpent or the snake. It goes back at least 70,000 years to the Salido Hills in Botswana, where the San people, also known as the Bushmen, say that the great python with his bag of eggs came and created humanity. There's so much symbolism to do with this stuff around the world. And this is a man called the Reverend Bathurst Dean. Obviously, he was a Christian, and he wrote a book called Worship of the Serpent, came out in 1933, and basically he did a study of worship of the serpent all over the world, and why and where it went. And this was his conclusion. It appears then that no nations were so geographically remote or so religiously discordant, but that one and only one superstitious characteristic was common to all, that the most civilized and the most barbarous bowed down with the same devotion to the same engrossing deity, and that this deity either was or was represented by the same sacred serpent. It appears also that in most, if not all, the civilized countries where the serpent was worshipped, some fable or tradition which involved his history directly or indirectly alluded to the fall of man in paradise in which the serpent was concerned. What follows then, but that the most ancient account respecting the cause and nature of this seduction must be the one from which all the rest are derived, which represent the victorious serpent, victorious over man in a state of innocence and subduing his soul in a state of sin, as he would say as a Christian, into his most abject